The war ended 3 years ago, and the world that came after it looks nothing like the one that existed before. I have spent enough time thinking about how to describe what happened. I keep coming back to the same conclusion. There is no clean way to describe it, so I will just say it plainly. The Vorrhn came. They hit the cities first, and then the smaller towns, and then anything else that was populated enough to matter to them. By the time they were done, most of what we had built as a civilization was either rubble or silence. The 5 of us were in the mountains on a camping trip when it started, and only 3 of us made it through to the other side. I lost people I loved in those 5 years. I will not say more than that here because saying more does not change what happened. I am not telling this story to explain grief. I am telling it because of what I found in the dead zone on the edge of what used to be Flagstaff, and because I think someone needs to know what is in there. The military won the war 3 years ago. I know because I was there. I know because Jabari built the relay network that disrupted the Vorrhn command signal in the final engagement. Jace and I were the ones sitting with our backs against an RV waiting for the scanner to go quiet for the first time in 5 years. When it finally did, we walked outside without checking it first, and that was the moment I understood the war was actually over. What came after was harder in a different way. The military declared victory on a Thursday, and by the following Monday, people were already trying to figure out what came next. The answer was not simple, and it was not fast. The infrastructure that made modern life possible had been hit as hard as the buildings. Power grids were down across most of the country. Water treatment systems were offline in every major city that had been in the impact zone. Supply chains that depended on those cities did not exist anymore. What people had was what they had managed to hold on to during the war itself, and whatever they could source from the terrain around them. The first year after the war ended was almost as hard as the last year of the war. The difference was that in the last year of the war you knew what was trying to kill you. Rebuilding is slower than destroying and quieter, and it does not come with the kind of clarity that survival does. We stayed in the canyon near Flagstaff because we knew the terrain. Jabari's signal relay was already rooted there. It was the place where it ended, and ending somewhere gives that place a weight that is hard to explain but easy to feel. We helped build the settlement over the first year. It started with the 3 of us and grew from there as other survivors found us through Jabari's communications network. The canyon had everything a settlement needed. Clean water from the spring Jace found during a perimeter sweep 3 months in. Enough flat ground for structures. Enough elevation and cover to make it defensible. By the end of the second year, there were 63 people living in the canyon. By the end of the third, there were over 100. Jace runs the security and scouting rotations for the settlement perimeter. He knows the terrain the way he has always known terrain, which is completely, and without having to think about it. He is out before sunrise most days checking the boundary markers, and he is back before the settlement wakes up fully, which is exactly the kind of thing he has always done without being asked. Jabari manages the communications network that connects our settlement to 11 others spread across the region. He has been rebuilding and expanding the network since the war ended. The scanner that kept us alive for 5 years has been repurposed into a relay node that is part of a larger grid covering most of northern Arizona. He still has the cracked glasses. He will not replace them because he says the crack is not in the lens that matters for reading, and I have never argued with him about it, because he is right. I manage food and resource production for the settlement. I run the garden systems that feed most of the canyon through the winter, and I train whoever is willing to learn how to identify and preserve what the surrounding terrain provides. My grandmother taught me everything I know about that, and I think about her every time I put something back into the soil that I took out of it earlier in the season. She had a way of explaining things that made them feel like they had always been obvious, once you heard them. She said the land remembers everything you give it and nothing you take from it without asking. I have tried to work by that principle since the day we put the first garden plot into the canyon floor. I think it is part of the reason the settlement eats as well as it does. The 3 of us share a structure at the edge of the settlement closest to the canyon rim. It is not large, but it has a good view in 3 directions, and Jabari has the 4th wall covered with equipment. We eat together most evenings. We do not have to talk much to understand what the other 2 are thinking. That is a kind of efficiency that only comes from spending 5 years figuring out how to stay alive together. The dead zone starts about 2 miles from the settlement boundary on the southwest edge of the canyon. I can see it from the rim on a clear day. The ruins of what used to be Flagstaff sit in a flat basin below the canyon system, and the air above them has a specific quality that is different from the air anywhere else. Not visible exactly. More like a stillness that does not shift the way normal air shifts. The military has a checkpoint at the primary access road into the zone, and another at the old highway overpass on the eastern edge. The signs say prohibited area and list a set of reasons related to residual energy hazard and structural instability. Most people in the settlement do not go near it. There are 2 military checkpoints on the main access routes, and the signs at both of them are not subtle about what the prohibition means. The military presence in the region is thin compared to what it was during the active engagement. It is organized and consistent, and the people running the checkpoints have been there long enough to take the assignment seriously. The dead zone has been off-limits since the week after the last Vorrhn ship went down. The reasoning given to the public is that the residual alien energy inside the boundary poses an ongoing health risk to anyone without specialized equipment. Civilians do not have access to that equipment. Whether that is the full explanation or a simplified version of it, I do not know. What I know is that nobody from our settlement has gone in and come back out to report anything different. Most people who survived the war have a reasonable relationship with the concept of things being dangerous and off-limits and do not feel the need to test it. I have been looking at that stillness above the ruins since the day we built the first structure in the canyon. It has pulled at me in a way I could not explain. I did not try to explain it for most of the first 2 years because I had enough to do and enough to think about without adding another problem to the list. By the 3rd year, I could not stop thinking about it. The pull had not faded the way I thought it might once we got busy enough with building. If anything, it had gotten stronger as the settlement stabilized and the daily work settled into a routine that left my mind with room to go where it wanted. I started tracking the dead zone the way Jabari tracked frequencies. Not with equipment, just with attention. I noted when the air above the ruins seemed different from the day before. I noted when the light moved through the stillness above the boundary in a way that did not match what the light was doing everywhere else. I could not quantify any of it the way Jabari could quantify the energy readings on his scanner, but I could tell that something about the zone was changing. The change had been gradual and consistent since the war ended. I brought it up to Jace one evening while we were eating. We were sitting outside on the flat stone ledge at the edge of the settlement. The canyon dropped away below us, and the dead zone was visible on the far side of the basin where the sun goes down. He looked at me for a long time before he said anything. The food on his plate was getting cold, and he did not seem to notice. He said he did not like the idea. I told him I knew that. He said the checkpoint was not the real issue. We both knew I could get around it using the same canyon routes we used during the war, when we needed to move without being tracked. I told him that was also something I knew. He did not say anything else for a while. Then he said he knew the difference between me having a thought and me having already made a decision. He would like to know which one this was. Jabari had been quiet on the other side of the table pulling up data on his equipment. He turned the scanner display toward us and showed us a graph of the residual energy readings he had been logging from the dead zone boundary for the past 18 months. The line on the graph was going down. Not dramatically, not all at once, but consistently and measurably downward since the month after the war ended. He said the energy was still there and still enough to kill all signal within the boundary. He was not going to tell me it was safe because he did not know if it was safe. But he said it was less than it had been, and that whatever was generating it was losing strength over time. I looked at the graph for a long time. The line did not tell me what was inside the zone, or why the energy was weakening, or what would happen if I crossed the boundary. It only told me that the thing holding me back had been losing strength for 18 months, and that whatever was generating it was not going to hold forever. I looked at both of them and told them I was going in the following morning. Jace put his cup down and looked out toward the canyon rim in the direction of the dead zone. It was the look he always had for things he could not stop from happening, but did not want to watch happen either. Jabari saved the current readings to his log. He said he would have updated numbers for me in the morning before I left. He also said I should take note of how my phone battery behaved inside the boundary. Neither of them said another word about it that night, and I did not either. There was nothing left to say, and we all three knew it, and the knowing was enough. I left the settlement before anyone else was moving. Jabari had left the updated scanner readings on the table the night before with a handwritten note beside them that said the boundary frequency was the lowest he had recorded since he started tracking it. The note did not say be careful, because Jabari did not waste words on things that went without saying. I folded the note and left it on the table. I took the canyon route south that Jace and I had used dozens of times during the war when we needed to move through terrain without being seen from the air. The route dropped below the canyon rim for most of its length and ran along the base of a series of rock shelves that broke up any sight line from above. I had walked it enough times during the war that I could move it in low light without thinking about the footing. The rock shelf sections had good cover, and the scrub on the open stretches was dense enough to move through without being obvious from a distance. It took about 40 minutes to reach the western approach to the checkpoint from the settlement. I did most of it without seeing anything move except a pair of ravens working the updraft above the eastern wall. It came out about a quarter-mile west of the military checkpoint on the primary access road into the dead zone. I had scouted the checkpoint on 2 separate occasions over the past month. I had not told Jace I had done it, because telling him would have started a conversation I was not ready to have at the time. The checkpoint was not heavily resourced. The military had a lot of dead zone perimeters to maintain across the region and a limited number of personnel to maintain them with, and the allocation reflected that reality. Our dead zone was not considered a high-priority access point because there was nothing near it that anyone was trying to reach. The ruins of downtown Flagstaff were not strategically significant to anyone anymore. They were just ruins. The rotation was predictable. 2 personnel at the barrier. 1 vehicle. The shift change happened at 7 in the morning, and the window between the outgoing unit leaving and the incoming unit arriving was about 4 minutes. 4 minutes was enough. I moved through the scrub west of the road. I crossed the access point at the lowest section of the barrier, where the ground dipped and the clearance was enough to pass under without touching the wire. The checkpoint was behind me before the sun had fully cleared the eastern canyon wall. The dead zone started without announcement. There was no visible line on the ground, no physical change in the terrain that marked the transition. What changed was everything else. The first thing I noticed was the phone. It had been showing 2 bars of signal on the walk down from the settlement. Then 1 bar. Then nothing. The screen still lit. The camera still worked. But every indicator that connected it to the outside world went flat at the same moment and stayed flat. The second thing I noticed was the air. It is difficult to describe what the dead zone air feels like to someone who has not stood inside it. It is not cold exactly. It is not heavy exactly. It is more like the air has stopped participating in the way air normally participates in the world around it. Normal air has a quality of movement to it even when there is no wind. It shifts. It carries sound and temperature and the faint chemical signatures of whatever is nearby. Dead zone air does none of that. It sits. It presses against you in a way that has nothing to do with temperature or barometric pressure. It presses in the specific way that an absence presses when the absence is large enough to have physical weight. I stood just inside the boundary for about a minute and tried to identify what I was feeling precisely. My phone was in my hand, and the screen showed nothing in any of the signal bars. I checked the compass app and it was still working, which confirmed I still had basic device function. The camera was on. I had checked the battery before leaving the settlement and it had been at 91%. It was at 84% already, and I had been inside the boundary for less than 2 minutes. The energy was doing something to the battery draw even with no active processes running. I made a note of that and kept moving. The closest I could get was this. During the war, the Vorrhn presence had a sound. Not a sound exactly. A frequency. Something we called the chest hum because it registered in the sternum before it registered in the ears. The dead zone felt like the place where that frequency used to live before something removed it. Not silence in the way that a quiet room is silent. Silence in the way that a room is silent after the thing that was making noise in it has just left and the air still remembers the shape of the sound. I had been inside the zone for about 3 minutes when I found the journal. I was moving along what used to be a commercial street on the southwestern edge of the city. The storefronts on both sides had collapsed inward, and the debris from the upper floors had spread across the sidewalks and into the road. Most of the material was concrete and glass and the occasional piece of signage that had survived in some distorted form. About 50 meters in, I passed a collapsed structure on the left side of the road. The front wall had come down in a single piece and created a low-angled space between the fallen wall and the original floor. The space was about 1 meter high and 2 meters deep, and it was dry inside and protected from the elements by the angle of the fallen concrete. Tucked into the back corner of that space was a waterproof field case about the size of a hardcover book. The case was gray and had a pressure seal around the edge. I opened it, and inside was a journal. The cover was plain dark canvas. The name on the inside front page was Felix. Below the name was a date from about 8 months after the war ended. Below that, a single line that said field notes on residual energy behavior in former impact zones. I sat in the angled space with the fallen wall above me and read the first several entries. The light inside the zone was sufficient for reading. The sky above the ruins was overcast in the specific flat way that canyon country gets overcast in the late fall. The diffused light came down through the open sections of collapsed roof above the street evenly and without shadow. It was quiet enough that the sound of the pages turning felt loud. I was aware the whole time of the specific quality of the silence around me. Not threatening, not empty. More like the silence of a room that still has something in it that you have not identified yet. Felix had been a scientist of some kind. The early entries were technical in a way that suggested training and precision. He described his equipment and his methodology and the specific frequency signatures he was tracking inside the zone. He wrote about the energy the way Jabari wrote about scanner data. No speculation. No drama. A level of specificity that suggested he understood what he was looking at well enough to be precise about it. The entry that stopped me was about 12 pages in. Felix wrote that the energy was not random. It was not simply the residual decay of whatever the Vorrhn weapons had released into the environment during the attack. It had structure. It had coherence. It behaved like a system rather than like scatter. He used the word holding twice in that entry. The second time he put it in quotation marks, as if he was not sure the word was accurate, but could not find a better one. I closed the journal and tucked it into the inside pocket of my vest and stood up. I checked my phone battery. 77%. The drain was steady and faster than anything I had seen from this device under any normal conditions. I made another note of that and stepped back out into the street. I stood there for a moment and looked at the ruins in every direction. Felix had come in here alone the same way I had. He had brought equipment and methodology and a scientific framework for understanding what he was finding. He had written about it with precision and discipline for the length of time it took to fill most of a field journal. And then he had stopped writing. The last entry in the journal that I had read so far was not finished. The sentence at the bottom of the last page I had reached ended mid-thought, and the next page was blank, and the rest of the journal was blank after that. I had not yet read far enough to find out what the last complete entry said. I put that thought aside and looked at the street in front of me. The ruins stretched in every direction without variation and with the specific flatness of a place that used to have height and dimension and no longer does. The buildings that had been tallest were the ones that had come down hardest. The lower structures at the street level had held their shapes better in places. A few sections of exterior wall were still standing at their original height with nothing behind them. Window frames with no glass. Doorways opening onto debris fields rather than interiors. The street itself was mostly clear of large material. Whatever the Vorrhn weapons had done to the structures, they had left the road surface relatively intact in most places, which made movement through the zone easier than I had expected. Nothing moved. Nothing made sound. The air sat in the specific dead zone way that I was already starting to recognize as its own category of stillness. I checked the battery one more time before I raised the camera. 69%. The drain had slowed slightly since I stopped moving, which suggested the energy interference was partly related to active processes. I made a note of that. I aimed the phone at the empty street ahead of me and pressed the button. I was not expecting anything specific. I was testing the camera function the same way I would test any piece of equipment in an unfamiliar environment before relying on it. The image took longer to resolve than it normally would. I watched the screen as the photograph developed and waited for the empty street to appear on it the way empty streets appear when you photograph them. What appeared on the screen instead was not an empty street. There was a figure standing in the center of the road about 30 meters ahead of me. It was not there when I looked up from the screen. The street in front of me was completely empty. I looked at the photo again, and the figure was there. A clear silhouette in the center of the road facing in my direction with a stillness that was different from the stillness of the ruins around it. I took another photo. The figure was closer. I had not heard anything. The street in every direction was as empty to my eyes as it had been when I arrived. But on the screen, the figure had covered the distance between its first position and its current one in the time it took me to press the button twice. I kept taking photos, and the figure kept moving closer with each one. I was doing this methodically rather than reactively, which I want to be clear about, because the methodical approach was a choice and not a natural response to what I was seeing. The natural response would have been to stop taking photos and leave. The methodical approach was to keep going and document what was happening with the same discipline I would bring to any unfamiliar situation in the field. I have spent enough of my life in situations where the right move was to keep moving and observe rather than stop and react, and that experience was useful here. By the fourth shot, it was close enough that I could make out proportion. It was human in shape, standing height, arms at its sides. The silhouette had the specific quality of something that was present in the space rather than something projected onto it. It was not a reflection, and it was not a lens artifact. I had been using this phone long enough to know every quirk of its camera, and none of those quirks produced a standing human shape in the center of a frame. By the sixth shot, the figure was close enough that I could see it was facing me. I lowered the phone and looked at the street. Nothing. I raised the phone and took another shot. The figure was 10 meters out and still facing me. I stood there for a moment with the phone in my hand and thought about what I was looking at in a way that was practical rather than reactive. Whatever was appearing in these photos was not registering to my eyes. It was registering to the camera sensor. The camera sensor was responding to something in the environment that my visual system was not capable of detecting on its own. That was the frame I decided to work within, because it was the only frame that was useful. I took 2 more shots in quick succession, and the figure had stopped advancing. It was still there in the frame, still facing me, but it had stopped moving closer. I moved further into the zone, and it stayed where it was in the next shot, which meant it was not following me. It was associated with a location rather than with my movement through the space. That was useful information. It suggested that whatever these figures were, they were not mobile in the conventional sense. They were present somewhere specific rather than moving freely through the zone the way a person moves. It was fixed in that location. I continued down the street and took photos every 30 meters or so, and new figures appeared in almost every frame. Each location had its own arrangement. Each arrangement felt specific rather than random. A figure near a doorway. A cluster of 3 near a vehicle that had been stopped in the middle of the road and then crushed flat by whatever force had moved through the area. A single figure standing at the edge of a collapsed parking structure looking upward at the open sky. I photographed each one and kept moving. The zone was larger than it looked from the settlement rim. What the eye read as a flat basin of rubble was actually a layered system of streets and blocks and intersections that had a logic to it even in ruin. The original grid of the city was still legible if you knew how to read it. I had driven through Flagstaff a handful of times before the war on supply runs with my grandmother, and I remembered enough of the general layout to navigate without getting completely turned around. Different positions, different distances from the lens. Some close and some far. Some facing me and some facing away. The further I moved into what used to be the commercial center of the city, the denser the figures became in the frames. I started keeping a running count as I moved through each block. 1 or 2 figures per frame in the outer areas near the boundary. 5 to 8 in the mid-zone where the building density had been highest before the attack. The intersection photo, with 11 silhouettes, was the densest I had captured at that point. The distribution was not random. It correlated with where people would have been at the time of the attack. The commercial center would have had foot traffic, office workers, shoppers, people moving between buildings on a normal day. The outer residential areas would have had fewer people on the street. The figure distribution in my photos matched that pattern almost exactly. A photo I took at an intersection showed 11 distinct silhouettes across the field of view. None of them visible to my eyes. All of them there on the screen. The phone battery was at 58% by the time I reached the intersection. I had been inside the zone for about an hour and 40 minutes at that point. The drain rate was higher than anything normal use would produce, but it had stabilized into a consistent pattern rather than accelerating, which suggested the energy interference had a ceiling rather than an escalating effect. I noted the battery level and the time and kept moving. The drain was consistent, and I started rationing the shots more carefully. I moved deeper into the zone using Felix's journal as a partial guide. He had described specific streets and landmarks in his early entries, and some of those descriptions matched what I was seeing around me well enough that I could orient myself using them. He had been thorough about documenting his route, which suggested he intended to come back and continue from where he left off. Scientists who document their routes are planning for continuity. They are building a record that a future version of themselves or a colleague can use to replicate or extend the work. Felix had been building that kind of record. The fact that the record ended where it ended was not something I spent time on while I was inside the zone. It was something I noted and filed and continued moving. The fact that the journal had been sitting in that collapsed structure since 8 months after the war ended suggested he had not been able to. I took a photo near a section of road where 2 streets intersected and the corner building on the northwest side had collapsed in a way that left the corner itself mostly intact. I recognized the corner. It had been a pharmacy before the war. My grandmother had taken me there once when I was about 9 to pick up a prescription. I had waited on the bench outside while she went in. I remembered the particular color of the awning above the entrance, which was a faded green that had been losing its color for years before the war made the question irrelevant. The awning was gone now. The corner of the building that held it was still standing. I took the photo and waited for it to resolve. There were 7 figures in the frame. 6 of them were distributed across the intersection in positions that did not mean anything specific to me. The seventh was standing directly in front of what used to be the pharmacy entrance. It was facing outward. It was facing me. I zoomed in on the figure on the screen the way you zoom in when you are not certain what you are seeing and need to be certain before you respond to it. The figure was clear enough at maximum zoom to see that the proportions were those of a person I recognized, not the face. The camera resolution and the nature of the silhouette did not give me a face, but the height and the build and the specific way the figure was standing with its weight distributed slightly forward the way someone stands when they are waiting for something they expect to arrive. I had seen that stance in every difficult moment of the 5 years we spent surviving together. It was the stance of someone who was waiting without impatience. Someone who understood that waiting was part of the work and who did not resist it. I knew whose stance it was. I stood in the middle of the intersection in the dead zone with my phone in my hand and did not move for a while. The street around me was completely empty. The air sat in its dead zone way. Nothing moved and nothing made sound, and the figure on my screen stood in front of what used to be a pharmacy entrance and faced outward and waited. I put the phone in my pocket and stood in the intersection for another minute without taking a photo. The street around me was empty and silent, and the air sat in its dead zone way against my skin. I did not feel threatened. I want to be clear about that. Whatever I was looking at in those photos was not threatening me. It was simply there. I walked back out of the zone the way I had come in. The checkpoint was clear on the return pass, and I was back in the settlement by mid-afternoon. I found Jace and Jabari at the main fire. I sat down between them and pulled out my phone and opened the photo gallery and set the phone on the flat stone between us without saying anything. Jabari picked it up first. I had expected him to say something about the battery percentage before anything else because Jabari's first instinct with any piece of equipment was to assess its operational status. He looked at the battery reading and then he looked at the photos. The equipment assessment gave way to something else. I recognized it as the look he got when data was telling him something he had not predicted. He went through the photos methodically the way he went through data, which was without expression and with full attention. He pulled out his scanner from the equipment bag beside him and checked the current boundary readings and compared them to the morning numbers. He did not say what the comparison showed. He set the scanner down and looked at the photos again. Jace picked up the phone after Jabari set it down. He went through the photos more slowly than Jabari had. Jabari had gone through them the way you go through data, which is with attention and without attachment. Jace went through them carefully, with the awareness that what he found might matter in a way he was not prepared for. He stopped on the last one, the one from the pharmacy intersection. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and I did not say anything either because there was nothing I could add to what the photo was already saying on its own. The fire between us had burned down to coals by the time any of us spoke. The canyon had gone dark around us while we were sitting with the photos, and neither Jabari nor Jace had moved to add wood to the fire, and I had not either. The darkness of the canyon at night is complete when the fire is down. The kind of dark that requires your eyes to adjust before the outlines of things become visible again. We sat in that dark for a while without any of us making a move toward the woodpile. Jabari said the boundary readings had shifted since that morning in a pattern he had not logged before in 18 months of tracking. Jace set the phone face down on the stone and looked at the coals for a long moment. Then he reached over and added a piece of wood to the fire without saying anything. I told them I was going back in. I went back in the following morning using the same route. The checkpoint rotation had not changed. The clearance under the barrier wire was the same. The air inside the boundary hit the same way it had the day before, which was all at once, and, without warning the moment, I crossed the threshold. I had charged my phone to full overnight, and I had a backup battery pack in my vest pocket that Jabari had handed me without comment when I left the settlement. The battery pack was one of the ones he had modified during the war to run at low power draw, so it would not generate a detectable heat signature. I appreciated the practicality of that. I pulled out Felix's journal as soon as I was inside the boundary. I opened it to the section in the back where he had drawn a hand-sketched map of the zone with coordinates marked at 12 specific locations. He had labeled each location with a letter and a short description. Location A was the entry point near the collapsed structure where I had found the journal. Location B was the pharmacy intersection I had photographed the previous day. Locations C through L were distributed across the deeper sections of the zone in a pattern that moved generally inward toward what had been the city center. Felix had also noted the energy concentration level at each location using a numerical scale of his own design. The numbers got higher the closer the location was to the center. I oriented myself using the map and started moving toward location C. The morning inside the zone was quiet in the way all mornings inside the zone were quiet, which was completely and without variation. The dead zone did not have morning sounds. No birds. No wind movement through leaves. No distant vehicle noise carrying from the road. The silence was the same at 7 in the morning as it had been at 2 in the afternoon the previous day. I suspected it was the same at midnight and at every other hour because the energy that created the silence did not have a time of day. It was a constant state rather than a fluctuating one. I had started to understand the dead zone silence as its own category of environment rather than as the absence of something. It was not quiet the way a forest is quiet on a windless day. It was quiet the way a sealed room is quiet. A quality of contained stillness that did not move or shift or respond to anything that happened inside it. It was 4 blocks northeast of the pharmacy intersection, and it had been a residential area before the war. Low buildings, small yards, the kind of neighborhood that had been dense with people on a normal morning. The energy at location C was noticeably different from the outer sections of the zone. I could not measure it the way Jabari measured things, but I could feel the specific quality of the dead zone air shifting. The pressure against my skin was more pronounced. The silence had more weight to it. I raised my phone and took a photo of the empty street. The frame showed 9 figures, all of them oriented in the same direction, all of them facing southeast. I noted that and moved to location D. The southeast orientation was not something Felix had noted in his coordinates section. He had documented figure counts at each location, but not their orientation. Either he had not observed the same pattern I was observing, or he had observed it and not yet had time to write it down before whatever stopped him had stopped him. I added a note in the margin of his map, marking the orientation at each location I visited. By the time I had worked through half the coordinates, the pattern was clear enough that I stopped being surprised by it and started just recording it. Location D had been a park. The park's original shape was still partially legible in the terrain. A central open space surrounded by the footprints of benches and plantings that had not survived the attack. The photo I took at location D showed 14 figures, all of them facing southeast, the same direction as the figures at location C. I kept moving through Felix's coordinates, and at every location I stopped and photographed and noted the figure count and the orientation. Felix's map was accurate in ways that impressed me. The distances between locations were correct. The landmark descriptions matched what I was seeing. He had noted which sections of road were clear and which were blocked by debris. His notes were reliable enough that I moved through the zone faster on this visit than the previous one. He had done his field work carefully. He had been thorough. Whatever had stopped him from continuing had not been a failure of preparation. By location G, the count was over 20 in a single frame. By location I, the figures were packed densely enough that I could not isolate individuals clearly. They were a mass of overlapping silhouettes, all facing the same direction, all facing southeast. Southeast was the direction of the canyon settlement. Southeast was the direction of the boundary. They were not facing inward. They were facing out. I photographed every location on Felix's map and made my own notes in the margins beside his entries, and I was back at the settlement by early afternoon. I found Jace doing a perimeter check on the eastern side of the canyon and told him I needed Jabari. He looked at my face, and whatever he saw there made him put the perimeter check aside without asking a question. That was something I valued about Jace. He was good at reading the difference between situations that required immediate information and situations that required immediate presence, and he defaulted to presence when he was not sure which one it was. We sat down together that evening with Felix's journal open on the table between us, and I read the later entries out loud. Felix had come to the same conclusion about the energy that I had started to reach on my own. He had gotten there faster and with more precision because he had equipment designed for the purpose. He described the energy as a frequency lock, and he was precise about what he meant by that term. A frequency lock was not a field or a zone of influence in the way that people imagined energy phenomena. It was an active signal, something that had to be maintained, something that required a source and a carrier and a target. A frequency lock did not simply exist. It operated. Felix had spent considerable time in his journal entries working through the implications of that distinction. I read those passages carefully. They were the part of the journal that told me not just what the energy was, but what it was doing. He used that phrase 3 times across 2 entries, and he defined it carefully each time, as if he was not satisfied with the definition, but could not find a more accurate one. He wrote that the energy had the structural characteristics of a command signal, not a weapon signature, not a decay pattern from an explosion or an energy weapon discharge. A command signal, something that had been designed to hold a state in place rather than to destroy. He wrote that the Vorrhn command infrastructure during the war had operated on a specific frequency architecture. The residual energy in the dead zones matched that architecture in a way that could not be coincidental. He believed the dead zones were not the result of the attack. They were the result of something the Vorrhn left running after the attack. Something that was still running. I stopped reading and looked at Jabari. He had not moved since I started the entry. He was looking at the table with the specific stillness he had when he was running something through a calculation in his head that he had not finished yet. I gave him the time to finish it. Jabari's processing was not something you could rush, and rushing it produced worse results than waiting. I had learned that during the war, when the difference between a complete analysis and an incomplete one had sometimes been the difference between a good outcome and a very bad one. I waited. Jace was looking at me. I asked Jabari what the Vorrhn command signal had operated on during the war. He told me without looking up from the table. I asked him if that matched what Felix had described in the journal. He picked up the journal and read the relevant passage himself. He set the journal down. He pulled out his equipment and called up the logs from the final battle. He sat with the logs and the journal side by side for about 4 minutes. Then he said the disruption pattern from the relay network during the final engagement matched Felix's described frequency architecture at a correlation he was not going to state a number for. The number was too high to say out loud, without sounding like he was overstating it. Jace said, "What number?" Jabari said, "Near perfect." The 3 of us sat with that for a while. The thing we were sitting with was not small. We had ended the war 3 years ago, and we had understood at the time what ending it had cost. We had counted what we lost and carried it forward and built something from what remained. What we had not known was that the ending itself had done something else. None of us had intended it. None of us had been told about it. None of us would have been able to predict it from where we were standing in that canyon on the day the scanner went quiet. The relay network that Jabari had built to win the war had also unlocked a door that the Vorrhn had left closed. And behind that door were all the people who had been standing on the other side of it for 3 years waiting for someone to open it. The figures in the photos I had taken that day were less defined than the figures from the previous visit. Not dramatically. Not all at once, but measurably. The silhouettes at the outer locations where the figures had been clearest the day before were softer today. It was not a dramatic difference. If I had not been looking for it, I might not have noticed it. But I had been looking for it because Felix's journal had predicted it. He wrote that as the frequency lock lost coherence, the figures it was holding would become less defined over time. Not because they were disappearing, because they were moving. The lock worked by holding things in place. As the lock weakened, the things it had been holding were no longer being held. They were no longer standing still in the locations where the attack had left them. They were doing what anything does when the thing restraining it stops working. They were moving toward the exit, less sharp at the edges, like a photograph that has been left in the light too long and has started to fade. The release had already started. It had started the day the war ended. Every day since then, the frequency lock had been losing coherence, and the people inside it had been moving closer to the boundary. My photos were not documenting a haunting. They were documenting an exit. That distinction was the most important thing I had understood since I first crossed the boundary. I sat with it on the walk back to the settlement. I let it settle into the place where things go when they are true, and you know they are true. I went back in for the third time 2 days later. I had spent the day between visits reviewing everything I had photographed and cross-referencing it against Felix's coordinate notes. I built a systematic plan for the third visit that would cover the remaining locations on his map and fill in the gaps between them. Jabari had updated his boundary frequency readings each morning since my first visit, and the numbers continued their downward trend in a pattern he described as consistent and accelerating slightly. The acceleration was small, not dramatic, but it was there in the data, and it meant the process was not plateauing. Whatever had been set in motion when the relay network disrupted the Vorrhn command signal 3 years ago was continuing to unfold on its own timeline. The timeline was not waiting for anyone to understand it before moving forward. I went in at first light the same way I had on the previous 2 visits. The checkpoint rotation was unchanged. The air inside the boundary hit the same way, and I stood with it for a moment the way I had started doing at the beginning of each visit. A few seconds of stillness before I started moving. Not ceremony, just acknowledgement. The zone had become familiar in a specific way across the 3 visits. Not comfortable, familiar. The way a difficult terrain becomes familiar when you have moved through it enough times to stop being surprised by its particular challenges. I knew the air now. I knew the silence. I knew the way the phone battery drained faster when I was actively shooting versus when I was just moving. I knew the texture of the ruins at the outer sections versus the way the rubble changed character closer to the center, where the initial impact had been most concentrated. Familiarity was not the same as ease, but it was useful. The zone had its own quality, and that quality deserved a moment of attention before I asked it to let me move through it again. The battery was at full. The backup pack was in my vest. I had Felix's journal and my own notes. I started at the point furthest from the boundary on his coordinate map, which was location L, at what had been the approximate geographic center of the city. The energy at location L was different from anything I had felt at the outer coordinates. The dead zone air everywhere had weight and stillness, but at location L the stillness had a different quality. Denser, more deliberate, like standing in the center of a room rather than near its edge. I raised the phone and took the first photo of the day. The frame was crowded in a way none of my previous photos had been. The silhouettes were layered, front to back across the full depth of the image. A crowd so dense that the individual figures were difficult to isolate from one another. I counted what I could and stopped at 30 before the overlap made the count unreliable. I took 3 more photos from different angles, and each one showed the same density. Dozens of figures in a space that was completely empty to my eyes. I moved through the remaining coordinates, working outward from location L toward the boundary in the order Felix had numbered them. This was the most systematic I had been across any of the 3 visits, and the systematic approach was producing the clearest picture. On the first visit, I had been reacting to what I found. On the second visit, I had been following a plan, but still adapting it as I moved. On this visit, I was executing a documented protocol, and the results were comparable across locations in a way that made the data meaningful rather than impressionistic. I had learned that from Felix's journal. He had been a methodical researcher, and his methodology had made his data usable even months after he had stopped being able to update it. At each location, the figure count was lower than at the center, and the figures themselves were less defined than they had been on my first visit 2 days ago. The fading was measurable now rather than subtle. The outer locations that had shown clear, sharp silhouettes on day 1 were showing softer outlines today. The process Felix had described in his journal was visible in the sequence of my photos. If you laid them out from first visit to third and compared the same locations across the sessions, the change was clear. I was building that comparison mentally as I moved, and the picture it produced was clear. The outer ring of the zone was the most advanced in the release process. The intersections were the least advanced. The center was where the lock had been strongest, and the center was where it was taking longest to lose its grip. Felix had mapped the energy concentration, and the concentration map was also a map of the release timeline. The highest concentration locations were the ones where the figures were still most clearly defined. The lowest concentration locations near the boundary were the ones where the figures had faded the most. The lock was losing its grip from the outside in. The figures nearest the boundary were the furthest along in the process. The figures at the center were the least changed. The center was holding longest. I was at location H when I found Felix in the photos. Location H had been a university building on the northwestern edge of the original campus. Most of the structure was down, but one section of the exterior had survived at partial height. The entrance steps were still mostly intact, leading up to a doorway that now opened onto open sky. I photographed the entrance steps. In the photo, there were 4 figures on the steps. 3 of them were oriented southeast toward the boundary, the same way every figure I had photographed across 3 days had been oriented. The 4th was not. The 4th was facing the camera. Facing me. I zoomed in on the 4th figure the way I had zoomed in on the figure at the pharmacy entrance on my first visit. The proportions were those of a man. The build was lean. The posture was the posture of someone standing in a doorway they know well. Someone who has stood in that particular doorway enough times that the stance has become specific to the location. I did not know what Felix looked like in life. I had no photograph of him, and his journal contained no physical self-description. But the figure on the entrance steps of the university building was not oriented toward the boundary the way every other figure was oriented. It was facing me. The journal in my vest pocket was his. The coordinate map that had brought me to this exact location was his. The fact that I was standing on this particular street at this particular moment was because of the work he had done before he disappeared. I stood with that for a moment. I did not try to process it into something conclusive. I took another photo, and the figure on the steps was still there and still facing me, and the 3 figures behind it were still facing southeast. I stood at the base of the entrance steps and looked at the doorway. Empty to my eyes. Nothing in the space that my senses could identify. But on the screen, the figure stood in the doorway and faced me. It had the specific stillness of someone who has been waiting in the same place for a very long time and has stopped being impatient about it. I put the phone away and continued through the remaining coordinates. The figures at the final locations near the boundary were the softest I had photographed. Some of them were barely distinguishable as figures at all. Shapes in the frame rather than silhouettes. The texture of absence rather than presence. At location B, which was the pharmacy intersection I had visited on my first day, I took a comparison photo from the same position I had used before. The figure that had been standing in the pharmacy entrance on day 1 was gone. The entrance was empty in the photo, the same way it was empty to my eyes. I stood there for a while and looked at the empty entrance on my phone screen. I did not try to name what I was feeling because naming it would have reduced it to something smaller than it was. I came out of the zone in the early afternoon, and walked back to the settlement. I found Jace and Jabari at the main fire the same way I had found them on the first evening. I set the phone down between us, and Jabari picked it up and went through the photos and then pulled out his scanner and checked the current boundary readings. He said the frequency had dropped further since the morning update. He said the rate of change was increasing. Jace picked up the phone and went through the full sequence of photos from all 3 visits in order. He had not done that before. On the previous evenings, he had looked at the day's photos. Tonight, he started from the beginning and worked forward. I watched him move through them, and I watched the sequence register on his face the way a slowly developing image registers. Not all at once, piece by piece until the full picture was there. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything. There was something in the way he held the phone while he looked at it that was different from the way he had held it on the previous evenings. The previous evenings, he had been processing data. Tonight, he was sitting with something that was not data. I did not push him on it. Some things require the time they require, and pushing does not change that. He looked at the figure that was facing the camera rather than the boundary, and he did not say what he was thinking, and I did not ask. I told them what I had understood on the walk back. The dead zone was not a place where people were trapped in the way that a locked room traps someone. A locked room keeps you in by preventing you from leaving. What the frequency lock had done was different. It had not prevented anything. It had held a state in place. The state of being there at the moment of the attack. The people inside the zone had not been trapped in motion. They had been held in place the way a note is held in place when you press the sustain pedal on a piano. The note does not end. It simply continues past the point where it would normally have faded. When we disrupted the Vorrhn command signal, we released the pedal. The note had been fading ever since. It was a place where the signal that should have released them had never fired. The war had ended, and the Vorrhn had been defeated, and the world had moved on, but the signal that the Vorrhn left running had kept on running regardless. Until we disrupted it. The dead zone was not a prison anymore. The figures in my photos were not haunting it. They were leaving. And the last thing any of them would see on their way out would be the same thing Felix had seen when he stood in the zone and realized what he was looking at. The world on the other side of the boundary. The world that had continued without them. The world they were finally being released back into, even if released was not quite the right word for what was happening to something that no longer had a body to release. I went in one final time at dusk. I had not planned to go at dusk. Every previous visit had been at dawn, and the dawn timing had been practical rather than ceremonial. Better light, cooler air, the checkpoint rotation favoring the early crossing window. But when I woke on the 4th morning and looked toward the dead zone from the settlement rim, the quality of the light above the ruins was different from anything I had seen before. I decided without spending much time on it that dusk was the right time for the last visit. The checkpoint rotation at dusk had a different window than at dawn. Longer gap between shifts. I crossed the barrier at the same low clearance point I had used on every previous visit. I moved through the scrub toward the zone boundary in the flat amber light of a late afternoon in early winter. The air inside the boundary was the lightest it had been across any of the 4 visits. The pressure that had characterized every previous crossing was still there, but reduced. The way a sound is reduced when the source is losing power rather than moving away. The silence had the same quality as always, but the weight of it was less. I noticed it immediately, and I stood just inside the boundary for the usual moment of acknowledgement, and this time the acknowledgement was different because what I was acknowledging was different. On the previous visits, I had been acknowledging a zone that was full of something. Today I was acknowledging a zone that was emptying. I started moving through the streets taking photos as I went. The figure counts at every location I had previously documented were lower than they had been on any of my first 3 visits. At location B, the pharmacy entrance was empty in every photo I took from multiple angles. At location C, the 9 figures I had counted on my first visit were down to 3. The 3 that remained were soft at the edges in a way that made me think of the last light before dark. Barely there. Present enough to be captured, but not present enough to be sharp. At location G, the crowd that had filled the frame on my second visit was now a handful of silhouettes widely spaced across the image. I moved deeper toward the center. The process had been working outward from the boundary inward across the time of my 4 visits, which meant the center locations were the most populated and the outer locations the least. But even at location L, the density was lower than it had been on my 3rd visit. The process was continuing. It did not stop between visits. It had been running continuously since the day the relay network fired 3 years ago. Every day since then it had been quietly doing what it was doing without requiring anyone to observe it or document it, or even know it was happening. I reached the deepest point of the zone near location L and raised the phone for what I intended to be the final photo of the final visit. I wanted a record of what the center of the zone looked like on the last day I would come here. I pressed the button. The image began to resolve on the screen the way images always resolved inside the zone, which was slowly and from the edges inward. I watched the frame fill in. The figures that appeared were fewer than on any previous center location photo. A dozen perhaps, widely spaced, all of them facing southeast. All of them with a soft edge quality that marked the advanced stages of the release process. I kept the phone raised and watched the last details of the image resolve, and then the screen went dark. Not a low battery shutdown. The phone did not give the low battery warning it normally gave before shutting down. It went dark in the middle of the image resolving. The last thing on the screen before the dark took it was a partial image. Half resolved. The left side of the frame had completed, and the right side had not. What the left side showed was 3 figures standing at what I recognized as the zone boundary itself. The collapsed overpass on the eastern edge that marked the line between the dead zone and the road beyond it. 3 figures standing at that line, facing outward, not facing me, not facing southeast into the interior, facing out, into the world beyond the boundary. I looked at the dark screen for a moment. Then I put the phone in my vest pocket and turned around and walked back toward the boundary. The walkout was the same canyon country it had always been. The same flat light of a winter dusk going gray at the edges. The same specific silence of the zone at my back and the returning sounds of the world as I crossed the boundary. I heard the wind first. A small movement of air through the scrub that I had not heard inside the zone, because the zone had no wind. Then a bird somewhere to the north. Then the faint creak of the barrier wire as the temperature dropped. Each sound was small. None of them remarkable. All of them ordinary in the way that ordinary becomes extraordinary when you have spent 4 visits in a place where none of those sounds exist. But the silence on that walk felt different from the silence on any of the previous return walks. It felt like a room after something has just ended rather than a room that has been still for a long time. I came out of the zone as the light was failing. The sky had gone from amber to the specific dark blue that comes just before full dark in high desert country. Jace was at the edge of the scrub on the settlement side of the checkpoint. He had not crossed the boundary, and he had not announced himself. He was just there in the way he had always been, just there when it mattered. He had not crossed the boundary. He was just there, standing where he could see the access point. He fell into step beside me without saying anything, and we walked back to the settlement together in the dark. Jabari was at the table when we arrived with a scanner and his logs and a cup of something warm he pushed toward me when I sat down. I pulled Felix's journal out of my vest and set it on the table. The journal had been with me on every visit inside the zone. It had been in my vest pocket through all 4 crossings, and the energy inside the zone had not damaged it. The pages were intact. The ink was unchanged. Whatever the energy did to electronic devices, it did not do to paper and ink, and I found that meaningful in a way I could not fully articulate. Felix had trusted the journal to survive inside the zone in a way he could not trust digital equipment to survive.
He had been right about that.
I opened it to the last page I had not yet read. The entry was short, shorter than any other entry in the journal. Felix had written it in a different hand than the rest of the entries. Slightly less controlled, like something written in low light or in a hurry or in a state where precision mattered less than getting the words down before the moment passed. It said that if someone was reading this, then the signal had been disrupted and the release had begun, and the only thing left to do was bear witness to it. That was the end of the entry. That was the end of the journal. Jabari looked at the page and then at his scanner. He said the frequency reading from the boundary was the lowest it had ever logged. He said the number out loud, and it was a number close enough to 0 that the difference between it and 0 was within the margin of measurement error on his equipment. He said it was possible the lock was already gone, and the reading was residual. He said it was possible the lock would reach 0 overnight or had already reached 0, and the remaining reading was instrument noise rather than actual signal. He said he would keep the scanner running through the night and update the log in the morning. He said it the way Jabari said things that mattered, which was directly, and without making it larger than it was. Jace did not say anything, and neither did I for a long moment. I looked out from the settlement toward the dark basin where the dead zone was, and I tried to see something different about the air above it. I could not see anything I could point to. I could not see anything different. The ruins were dark and still in the way they had always been dark and still from this distance in the evening. But the air above them felt different than it had felt on every previous evening I had stood in this spot and looked in that direction. It felt lighter, like something that had been pressing against the world from the inside had finally stopped pressing. I thought about what the war had cost. I thought about Neha and Rio. I thought about Jace's family and Jabari's family and my grandmother and everyone else who had been in a city or a town or a populated place when the Vorrhn arrived. I thought about all of them spending 3 years in the particular silence of the dead zone, while we spent 3 years in the canyon learning how to rebuild a world they were no longer part of. Not in the broad way that people talk about what wars cost when they are summarizing them for people who are not there. In the specific way, the specific names, the specific faces, the specific mornings that did not happen because of what happened first. I thought about the people in the zone who had spent 3 years in that particular silence, not knowing the war had ended, not knowing the world had kept going without them, not knowing that 3 young people in a canyon had built a relay network that would eventually do 2 things at once without knowing it was doing either of them. I thought about Felix standing at the university entrance in the photo on my phone. I thought about the vow the 3 of us had made in the 5th year of a war that none of us had chosen, and all of us had survived. I thought about what it meant that keeping the vow had brought us to this canyon. Being in this canyon had put us in the position to do what we did on the last day of the war. Jabari was writing in his log. Jace was looking at the ruins the same way I was looking at them. Neither of us spoke. The 3 of us sat at the edge of the settlement in the dark together. The air above the dead zone was lighter than it had ever been. The frequency that had held everything in place for 3 years was gone, or close enough to gone that the difference did not matter. We had come here to survive, and we had survived. We had not known we were going to do anything else, but we had. Bearing witness to what we had done without knowing we were doing, it was the only thing left. It was enough. It was exactly what was needed. It was what the 3 of us did together at the edge of the canyon in the dark on the night the frequency finally went quiet.